Today's program is brought to you by the Ardsley Historical Society, and my name is Pete Marcus, and I'm the president. How many of you in the audience are members of the Historical Society? Fantastic. Fantastic. That's great. For those of you that aren't, I have applications up here if you'd consider joining. Benefits of membership: we have 2 newsletters a year. As a matter of fact, our fall newsletter is nearing completion and should be coming out within the next several weeks. We have a calendar, pictorial calendar, that comes out the end of December. We conduct programs like this. We're currently actively working with the Ardsley Middle School. They have a history club, and some of our famous archives, including our Revolutionary War cannonball, are currently on display in the lobby of the middle school building. And we also handle inquiries that the public sends us from time to time about, their relatives or classmates or whatever, and we try and answer those as best we can. Today's speaker is someone, if you've lived in Ardsley for any length of time, you know, and that's Walter Schwartz. Judge Walter Schwartz served as Ardsley Village Justice for 36 years, from 1982 to 2018, and before that as Ardsley Village Trustee from 1975 through 1979. He was the village historian for 5 years and a past president of the Ardsley Historical Society. He also served on the Westchester County Historical Society Board of Directors for 6 years. He now resides in White Plains with his wife Harriet, a former Concord Road Elementary School teacher and a 20-year volunteer at the Ardsley Public Library. Walter has written several published articles on local history and given numerous talks, but none previously on the subject you're about to hear this afternoon, the new Croton Aqueduct in Ardsley. So without further ado, I will welcome up our speaker for today, Walter Schwartz.
Thank you, Peter. I couldn't take any further ado. When I finish later this afternoon, the people in this room, you and myself, are going to know more about the new Croton Aqueduct than you ever dreamed about. And then we hope, and I was tagged here, I'm not sure what it is, that this broadcast will go far and wide. But anyway, thank you very much for coming. Pete asked me on the phone a few days ago whether I would prefer to take questions at the beginning or in the middle or the end. And I wasn't quite sure. I usually like to move on and not get interrupted because, we could go off on a tangent. But on the other hand, I really welcome your participation in any questions and any, not so much questions, but comments or experiences that any of you may have had with or involving or hearing about the new Croton Aqueduct. So we'll kind of play it by ear. But I want to now go to something that I invariably try to remember to say every time I get up to give a talk. Or a question that I frequently ask when I attend a talk on a subject of history or otherwise presented by other people. And that is, how did you happen upon this subject? What caused you to write, talk, or come here today about what is your interest? How did it become evoked? So I'll tell you. For many years, and by the way, not only was Pete's mentioned Harriet being a Concord Road elementary school teacher for many years, but a colleague of hers, a very good colleague of hers, was Rosemary Marcus, Pete's wife, and they both taught at Concord Road for a number of years. Concord Road had a local history program that started in the 4th grade as part of their curriculum, and I would, from time to time, be asked to attend. But then other curriculums came in, and those curriculums went aside and were cast aside. But a 2nd grade teacher by the name of Sue Friedman, had a real interest in history, in local history, although it wasn't a requisite. And she asked me if I would be interested in giving a little tour, inviting the children, second graders, into the courthouse, telling them some of the old silly stories about old laws in Ardsley and other things of that nature. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed doing. It kind of inspired me, just as it inspires me when I get up and I talk about local history to grown-ups. But for about 10 years, until maybe about 10 years ago, we've been out of Ardsley and in White Plains for the last 5 years, but for a span of about 10 or 12 years, I would in June meet all of the second grade classes, 2 classes at a time, and usually they had 5 or 6 as I recall, down right over here at the base of Heatherdale Road. They would walk down with their teachers and parent escorts, meet me at the bottom of the hill, and I would take them on this little tour into the courthouse. Then we'd have the court program. But on the way, we would pass this strip here, obviously on the sidewalk the other side of the street. And they'd be walking 1 or 2 by 2, and I'd be at the front. And then I'd pause, and having explained to them the American Legion building and a little bit about its origin, the library that most of them already knew about, the community nursery school that our now 54-year-old oldest daughter attended before kindergarten, of course, way back when. But I would want to tell them about what I considered to be maybe the most significant event in all of Ardsley's history. Something they hadn't heard about. I knew they hadn't heard about. The new Croton Aqueduct. But how could I do that when I couldn't show them the library or the nursery school or the American Legion or the police department building or the municipal building? Because it's invisible to us. There's one member of this audience, I won't mention her or his name right now, but I recently became informed that person actually visualized, actually knows a lot more about what I'm talking about in a certain way. And we'll get to that later on because I'm sure you'll be interested in hearing the comments from her or him. Okay? I'm trying to disguise this as best I can. It's not Harriet, by the way. Anyway, so my interest was right there. And it was my own curiosity, and it was some questions that I really couldn't answer because I knew very little about the new Croton Aqueduct. Now, most of us in this room, I'm sure, I won't even ask you to raise your hands, know about the old Croton Aqueduct, the one that runs, we're familiar in Hastings, where it kind of crosses Main Street at the top of, at the top of the hill, where it's in Irvington as an overpass, a beautiful aqueduct that we can drive under, 1 car at a time, of course, very cautiously. And other places along the way that we have heard about. I'm a graduate of City College, and down at 135th Street and Convent Avenue, there is the most, how did the New York Times describe it? The most interesting architectural feature that still exists of the new Croton Aqueduct. It's the 135th Street Gatehouse. More about that later. So that also helped pique my interest in it. And of course, I have walked, as many of you have, along the trailways, or biked, or had a tour, or been to the Keeper's House, which Pete and I attended in Dobbs Ferry some time ago, and are familiar with those trailways that go all the way up Irvington, Terrytown, and certainly far beyond. That's the old Croton Aqueduct. So now I'm going to take my notes and venture into some more details. I wrote a paper that I hope will be published, perhaps in the Historical Society newsletter sometime in the future, on the new Croton Aqueduct, and I shared it with Peter, by the way, whose thanks I want to give right now for helping me and encouraging me along the way. And I also want to thank Rob Pellegrino, who couldn't be here today. He spoke to me last night on the phone and he explained why. But Rob presented some slides, which I have not seen, so we're going to be seeing them at the same time at the completion of my program. It runs deep in the ground beneath some of Ardsley's most significant properties. The public library, where we are right now, the ambulance corps building, the community nursery school, and scores of private homes. It was the most significant, complicated, and dangerous engineering marvel ever undertaken within the boundaries of Ardsley. It was critical to the lives, health, and safety of the millions of people who populate New York City and parts of Westchester County. Yet, the new Croton Aqueduct, invisible to local residents and passers-by, is rarely a subject of discussion, even among historians. From survey to final completion, the project consumed nearly a decade, with workmen toiling perilously in dark and hazardous conditions well below the surface. Overall, it employed 10,000 laborers, engineers, and inspectors, and hundreds of animals, mostly mules, and steam engines, costing the lives of nearly 100 men during construction and $20 million in late 19th century dollars, a large part of that attributable to contractor fraud. Locally, it was claimed to have resulted in the evil effects of rowdy workers, unsafe and unsanitary temporary buildings, blasting noises, intoxication, fires, and the threat of disease, all of which factored in the establishment of Ardsley as a village. Protected by the federal government, policed by New York City's Department of Environmental Protection, it carried nearly 300 million gallons of water daily, tunneling its way for 33 miles, as much as 400 feet below the surface in some places, moved by power other than gravity at a grade of less than a foot per mile from watersheds in Westchester and Putnam County into northern Bronx to be converted to sanitary drinking water. However, unlike the old Croton Aqueduct, its smaller and older and retired cousin journeying just a couple miles to the west, it now receives little recognition because it has no scenic walking trails nor bicycle paths, no tours or tunnel sections open for visitors, and no friends for financial support. Nonetheless, the new Croton Aqueduct is an integral, albeit unnoticed and underappreciated part of Ardsley's history. The old Croton Aqueduct, a few words. The original Croton Aqueduct, or what only half a century later came to be known as the old Croton Aqueduct, a 41-mile water distribution system from the Croton River in northern Westchester to reservoirs in Manhattan, was triggered by major catastrophes in New York City, a cholera epidemic in 1832, and a massive fire that destroyed hundreds of lives and buildings in 1835. This enormous engineering project, the old Croton Aqueduct, constructed between 1837 and 1842, eventually became antiquated and has been virtually out of service since 1955, although a portion of it later reopened in Ossining. The old Croton was built with specifications designed to serve the needs of New York City's growing population in the mid-1880s. However, by the time that era had arrived, the imperative had become far more urgent and the predictions inadequate and incorrect. This necessity of bringing millions more gallons of water into the city led to the building of the new Croton Aqueduct. The old Croton was built for a capacity of nearly 100 million gallons daily, while the new tunnels, 13.5 feet high rather than only 8.5, would be designed to carry 3 times that volume. History links these 19th century technological wonders much like older and younger cousins, generations apart, but following close and nearly parallel pathways from common ancestry in upstate rivers and watersheds. Conceived at different times, from different parentage, each has its own distinct appearance, character, identity. In some places, such as the Croton Dam and at the 135th Street Gatehouse in Upper Manhattan, they converge. At other sites, they follow very separate lifelines. At historic High Bridge, the original aqueduct strikingly spans the Harlem River, while the new Croton Aqueduct, unseen, is tunneled into solid limestone 300 feet deep under that river. Construction of the new Croton Aqueduct. The five-fold increase in population of New York City from 1840 to 1880, a worldwide fiscal panic of 1873, which delayed construction of a new water distribution system, and a severe drought in 1880 and 1881 generated realization that the old Croton Aqueduct was becoming terribly insufficient. In February of 1882, a plan was submitted to the mayor of New York City calling for construction of a masonry dam and reservoir across the Croton River to ensure steady passage of clean and safe water into the city. Let's pause for a moment about the need for water in New York City. Well, the population had increased. Sanitation was terrible. Horses were on the roads as the main transportation. There were fires. The fire departments were small and local, didn't have major equipment to fight them. And people were dying of cholera and other intestinal diseases because of the contamination. Recognizing an emergency on June 1st, 1883, the New York State Legislature passed a law called the Aqueduct Act to provide new reservoirs, dams, and a new aqueduct for the probable future requirements of the city. That was their words. By the winter of 1884 and 5, meticulous surveys had been completed, contractors chosen, machinery set up, and the work, and when I do this it means I'm quoting from the source, of the great engineering accomplishments of our day proceeded day and night so that the tunnel would have been completed before the end of 1889 if the frauds of some of the contractors had not been discovered. Work was done in three parts. The first section was a masonry conduit that extended 24 miles from Croton Lake to the proposed Jerome Park Reservoir in the Bronx, near what's now Lehman College and was Hunter College. The second part, also a masonry conduit, ran almost 7 miles under pressure from Mosholu Avenue, now Mosholu Parkway, under the Harlem River to the gatehouse at 135th Street. There I go again. This section was constructed in the form of an inverted siphon. The final section ran 2.5 miles from 135th Street to Central Park. The roof, the walls, and the floor were brick. The space from the outside of the brick to the line of excavation was designed to be filled with solid rubble masonry. So that's the above the tunnel and yet deep in the ground. However, dishonest contractors left huge spaces either entirely empty or only partially filled, causing stoppage, delays, and additional expense. 32 principal shafts, you'll hear that word later, were sunk, with 28 of the shafts intended to be open to be needed whenever the tunnel is to be cleaned or repaired. Blow-offs of stone masonry were built to carry off the surplus water and empty the aqueduct, as Peter explained briefly, at points where the water in the tunnel can be diverted. Gates were created, kind of like locks, as we are familiar with locks in the canals or the Mississippi, to be open when necessary to send water through the blow-offs, which happens here, to be passed into the Sawmill or Picantico rivers, and thereafter into the Hudson or Harlem rivers. For the most part, the grade is only 0.7 of a foot, so what is that, 8 or 9 inches maybe, per mile, except where particular difficult excavation was encountered. The tunnel runs under the Harlem River and later reaches the 135th Street Gatehouse, where the flow is conducted by 8 pipes. That's where the converge occurs. 8 pipes at that point, 135th Street, of 48-inch diameter each, half of them extending to the Central Park Reservoir, which has been decommissioned. It was where the public library is, and the others branching off. More than 300,000 cubic yards of brick were laid, enough to build 38 structures like the Herald Tribune building on 41st Street, and the material excavated with the masonry, enough to build a wall 10 feet thick and 55 feet high around Manhattan Island. The flowing capacity was reported to be 318 million gallons per 24 hours. 318 million gallons per 24 hours. Sufficient, it said, for the uses of the city when it is several times larger than it is today. That was written by the Harper's Weekly in 1889. Later studies update the history by saying that the engineering was extremely accurate, the tunnels driven from the respective portals and shafts meeting very closely to grade and alignment. Although the alignment had to be done at night by sighting to plummet lamps to prevent errors by radiation of reflected rays of the sun during the daytime in hot weather. So let's look at it this way. We think sometimes of these things as tunnels. Well, yeah, we can call the aqueduct a tunnel. It is. It's invisible to us. It's underground, and it's a tunnel, and it carries water. And as I said, it's about 13 feet high. And it's shaped like a horseshoe, so it's kind of flat in the bottom section, but otherwise it's shaped this way. But it wasn't built by just digging 33 miles from the Croton Dam into the Bronx or Manhattan. It was built through these shafts right here in Ardsley, shaft number 14, where they first installed a gatehouse, and then they get down. And that's how they get down to clean it. So a shaft is like a vertical tunnel to get down. I guess that's how they build tunnels under rivers, too. There's nothing to dig out, but until you get down there. Another source says extremely heavy materials had to be hauled for miles over steep grades by hundreds of teams of horses and mules over dirt roads and by steam engines to haul away debris. The work was depicted as dark, damp, and dangerous. 92 men were killed, many more seriously injured with broken bones. As many as 10,000 laborers were engaged at one time. Apart from delays resulting from defective workmanship that had to be rectified, 1,000 workers went on strike in 1886 to demand an extra 25 cents per day. The tunnel work was finally completed in June of 1891 at a cost of almost $20 million, $700,000 over estimate, and several years prior to completion of the construction of the Croton Dam and Reservoir. Now I'm going to get a little specific about Ardsley after I take a drink of water. I purposely didn't take some spring water in a little bottle. I felt I'd rather have some tap water. And this is a souvenir from Aspect 2016, so I thought it'd be particularly appropriate. Pardon me. Okay, refreshed. That's what this is all about, right? Construction problems in Ardsley. To construct the horizontal tunnel sections, the engineer provided for a total of 32 principal vertical passageways or entryways called shafts, leading underground from the surface. And they vary from a depth of only 22 feet in Yonkers to 420 feet at the Harlem River. 28 shafts were intended to be capped later, but available for future cleaning or remedial work. In Ardsley, or Ashford, as it was known until 1883, the area surrounding shaft number 14, and by the way, they were numbered, so shaft number 1 would be all the way up north by the Croton Dam. But shaft 14 in Ardsley presented as particular challenges for engineers, contractors, and workmen. As described in Harper's Weekly, from Gould Swamp, you heard that name, Gould, on the Irvington estate of railroad magnate Jay Gould, the tunnel passes through the hills back of Terrytown in Irvington under the Sawmill River near Ardsley. The ground near and about Ardsley was about the most treacherous that was encountered due to serious fissures which broke in, filling the tunnel and necessitating a good deal of construction for holding the troublesome mass until the masonry could be built. As the work progressed, additional shafts were sunk to meet the problems that developed and could not have been foreseen. Thus, there was shaft 12B at Sawmill River Crossing, 13.5, and 15.5 at Ardsley, etc. The reports of the New Croton Aqueduct and dams to the City of New York Aqueduct Commission confirms that the most difficult section to excavate was a 110-foot stretch south of Shaft 13, which would bring it close to Ardsley, or in Ardsley. A special system was necessary due to the 160-foot deep pockets of mud, which, according to the reports, required an additional 92 weeks to resolve. Arthur Silliman, an historian and head of Ardsley schools from 1922 to 1958, provided some additional local facts that I briefly alluded to previously. This is what he wrote. Each shaft was surmounted by a granite gatehouse with access to a cutoff valve. Shaft 14, fairly close to the surface, controlled a blow-off to the Sawmill River to clean out any accumulated dirt and clear a section for repairs. This gatehouse, just south of the present American Legion building, and you'll see it if your car is parked over there, was torn down a few years ago, according to Silliman's book in 1971. So we came here in 68. We didn't have the privilege of seeing it. This gatehouse was capped with a concrete slab, and that's that slab. Peter measured it, what was about 23, 24 feet in square. Thank you. The Legion, the Legion, the Ambulance Corps, and the Community Nursery School all occupy land formerly controlled by the aqueduct. And some of the older residents may remember, your parents would have remembered this, I'm sure, when this area was once an official playfield for the nearby school children. Here's something I didn't know until I started my research. American Legion Drive was once Aqueduct Street. One can visualize, this is according to Silliman, one can visualize the course of this man-made underground river, as he called it, by standing under the traffic light, Ashford Avenue, in front of the now former Ashford Avenue School, and looking north, this direction, north, along Legion Drive toward the Concord Road School, sitting prettily, he wrote, 175 feet above the aqueduct. In fact, the Board of Education had to get an easement from New York City to build the school, same as the library building, where we are now, had to get an easement from New York City to build the library. Now that brings up an interesting subject, because occasionally, and hopefully very, very infrequently, it becomes necessary for New York City DEP, which has the responsibility of protecting and cleaning the aqueduct, because it's New York City Aqueduct, DEP of necessity has to get in. Now, if they had, for instance, a mammoth oil spill or something like that, and the cause was right here by the oil company over-delivering oil or somebody making a mistake, well, they could require this structure or part of it to be torn down, or at least temporarily vacated, let's call it. Anyway, and that can't happen. Maybe we'll get to that later. To continue, is what he says here. I recall, I said this already, when the library building was discussed, an easement needed to be obtained from New York City for the land. I believe, if memory serves me correctly, that the city granted it for a nominal fee of $3,000 upon the condition that if it ever had to get under the building for repairs to the adequate, it had the unrestricted right to do so. This did occur in the early 2000s, etc. Although I have no recollection of personally attending the boxing match, I remember vaguely that an amateur boxing match sponsored by one of the local organizations, it could have been the Lions Club or something like that, took place on that 24-foot square concrete slab top shaft number 14. Now, what about the impact and the effect of Ardsley, which I consider to be maybe the essence of this program, or the nitty-gritty, let's call it? In his historical sketch of Ardsley, a souvenir publication distributed in October 1903 in connection with the Methodist Episcopal Church Fair, The Reverend Eli Quick, Q-U-I-C-K, discussed the impact and effect upon local residents, their hamlet, and the environment during the building of the new Croton Aqueduct. It naturally led to the erection of a number of buildings without stability, he wrote, put up simply for temporary use. It introduced an element of transience in our neighborhood, not of the best type of character, and while it provided a temporary stimulus to business, it was accompanied by circumstances prejudicial to the best development of our town. During that period, the streets were usually filled with a class of working people, more or less rude and more or less intoxicated. While the work of blasting was going on, occasionally buildings would be shattered, while the sensitive nerves of the village people would be shook. Also, the vicinity was disfigured in some places by the unsightly heaps of earth and stone taken from the excavations made by the workmen. There was also the cutting of all the natural drainage in some of the marshy places, thereby destroying the healthfulness of the vicinity and increasing the tendency to malaria. We have no contrary evidence. However, Reverend Quick had not arrived in Ardsley until several years after what he called the Aqueduct period, when the Croton Aqueduct was put through here. He based his works upon hearsay, upon being told, this is his words, that the Reverend Thomas Lodge, who was appointed pastor here in the spring of 1889, declared that it would take 20 years for the community to recover from the evil effects of the Aqueduct period. Reverend Quick added his own commentary. He, Reverend Lodge, was correct, for although there has been considerable expenditure of both time and money, we have not yet, as of 1903, fully recovered. Writing nearly 70 years later, Arthur Silliman opined, quote, business was stimulated by construction of the new Croton Aqueduct by New York City, a tremendous operation for those days, involving hundreds of laborers as well as skilled tunnel workers. In their Pictures of the Past, Ardsley, New York, 1986, the local historians and longtime residents, and I can say friends, Patricia and Fred Arone, drew upon their own research to make the following statements and conclusions. This is what they wrote. Accelerated change and development became evident in the 1890s. Constructed between 1884 and 1893, I think it finished a couple of years before that, the new Croton Aqueduct passed directly through Ardsley. Ardsley's local saloons, hotels, and businesses boomed with the influx of laborers, and the community became a rowdy, Wild West town. Without organized local government, there was no fire or police protection, and life in Ardsley became somewhat disruptive for the ordinary citizens. From the perspective of more than 80 years after Reverend Quick, the Arones offered a more positive note upon the impact, and they said, after the construction had ended, many of the Irish and Italian workers settled in the school district, where they contributed greatly to the future development and improvement of the community. Just a general side, when I was serving as judge, there was in the old courthouse, municipal village hall, libraries from my predecessors, Judge McCormick and Judge McDowell. Judge McDowell began as judge in 1912. So now I'm updating Reverend Quick 1903 just to 1912. So I looked through them because I was really wanted to see what kind of cases that had taken place in the early years of the 20th century. And a lot of those cases, I'd say half of the criminal cases in the criminal docket I looked at, I went through a couple of these huge volumes, had to do with public intoxication or what I would classify as leaning against a light pole on a Friday evening after getting drunk. There were a lot of saloons, and I had a conversation with Rob Pellegrino about this yesterday, and he mentioned to me, and at the same time reminded me, that in Dobbs Ferry and Ardsley, there were a lot of saloons. And that was the case in the Wild West. It was the case in the settlement of Alaska, et cetera, et cetera. The workers worked very hard, very long. They were away from their families. And every night was Friday night. And but what pained me as a judge was that, and I'm sure Gary can relate to this, what I'm going to say here too, because Gary's a lawyer, was that so many of those laws were stricken off the books, found illegal, unfair, just like what they're doing kind of as marijuana now. I don't want to get into the political subject of marijuana, but, well, I will for a moment. I'm going to digress. So I had many cases in court, possession of marijuana. And first offense, they would always get an ACD, an adjournment, contemplation of dismissal. It was like, this is a waste of time. And I had no control over it as judge because the prosecutor would present the case. Second offense, the maximum fine was $100. That was it. Go on your way. Third offense, the maximum fine was $200. We had a couple of those. And now those are being, a lot of them are being wiped off the books too. So times change. But it was, I don't care if you gave me a raise of 25 cents a day. Not that I could physically do that work, but who would want to? You're subjecting yourself to all kinds of diseases, claustrophobia, you're in tunnels. It's like being a mine worker. But they did it, and they did it. And yeah, 92 of them lost their lives, and so many lost their limbs. Okay, thank you. The route of the new Croton Aqueduct. A broken double line on the Westchester County Atlas of 1893 identifies the new Croton Aqueduct. However, few places on that ancient map above or near the route would be recognizable today other than somebody really looking at it deeply. These are the former lands of Cyrus Field, various farming and dairy properties, Captain King's Pickle Works, the home of Ardsley's first village officials such as Lawrence, Odell, and McCartney, and the New York City and Northern Railroad, later the old Putnam Line, which arrived in Ardsley in 1880 in time to help cart and haul away debris from the building of the aqueduct. Nevertheless, it's fascinating to go up there and look at those, and they're in color. The Westchester County Atlas of 1930 more clearly reveals the New Croton Aqueduct, identified as New Croton Aqueduct, permanent easement, City of New York water supply. Let me mention for a moment that in this 33-mile stretch, other than under the Harlem River or where it channels off into 8 4-foot chambers to go into New York City. Other than that, the aqueduct, I'm losing my train of thought for a moment. Okay, we're going to go on to something else. So most of it is owned by private people. Now, Pete got a little bit scared because I showed him the map up by Bramblebrook and Augustine. He lives on Augustine Avenue to the south of the village, up a bit of an incline. And his house just misses having the aqueduct. So he could have been concerned if he had an oil spill or anything else that they could say, hey, we got to get under here, because it is an easement and it's in everybody's deed along the way. But peculiarly right here, where we're standing, right here, this building and the community nursery school, as explained to us by Larry Tomaso, the current building inspector in Ardsley, longtime building inspector, I should have said, that's owned by New York City because it's so near the shaft and the blow-off property. So it became very important. So the village doesn't own this land here or the building. And then it takes a very interesting route because, all right, let's go to the north. So community nursery school, library, blow-off property, parking lot, and then it cuts this way. And so the parking lot, is this right, Pete? Of where the diner is, the Ardsley Diner, and those other stores, it's all owned by, it's all part of New York City. Just that little channel, kind of right angle. Okay. Anyway, it's under some key, the aqueduct is under some key places here. It's under the Concord Road School. It's under a portion of Heatherdale Road, where Powderhorn intersects the foot of Beacon Hill Road. It continues under these library buildings and the ambulance corps building, and then it continues across Ashford Avenue, part of what was the old school. Now it's the Ashford Court condominiums, and then all the way on and into the city. I'm going to be very brief about the gatehouse because I've talked about it already, but it's now it's back in use. The water is still underneath, about 40 feet below the first level. I've been inside. In fact, I had occasion about 10 years ago, by appointment. I told them what my interest was, and I was a City College graduate. And I saw the original, a set of original books for the construction of the aqueduct, because they are on file there. If anyone wants to take a trip, it's a wonderful building, and it's now called the Harlem Stage Gatehouse. So what's the status? I've got just a page and a half left. What's the status of the New Croton Aqueduct today? In decades following these two great 19th century engineering marvels, the 92-mile-long Catskill Aqueduct would come about and be built in 1915, followed by the 85-mile Delaware Aqueduct 30 years later. Why do I mention them? Because nowadays the Catskill-Delaware watershed provides 90% of the water for New York City and environs, other than when it is temporarily taken out of service for repairs, cleaning, or upgrades. The New Croton still furnishes about 10%. Aqueducts require inspection, constant maintenance, and sometimes major repairs. None are built to last forever. In the late 1990s, New York City suspended usage of water from the Croton Reservoir and emptied the New Croton Aqueduct. That's the late 1990s. Thus began a $177 million major rehabilitation project, which ended in 2014, 15 years, when the line was restored to service, I'm pleased to say. The work included regrouting the brick lining of the tunnel, including 34 shaft site connections that allow crews to access the tunnel from ground level, and repairing valves and pumps that allow certain Westchester communities, including Ardsley, to pull water from the aqueduct when necessary. Included was connecting the aqueduct to the massive $3 billion Croton water filtration plant located under the Van Cortlandt Park Golf Course in northern Bronx. A few miles from Ardsley, the old Croton Aqueduct, now virtually empty and out of service since 1955, other than a small portion which supplies water to parts of Ossining, follows a path in Irvington just west of Broadway, where it picturesquely travels above ground at Station Road, south of the Irvington Railroad Station, then continues through Dobbs Ferry, Hastings, Yonkers, and on to New York City. The old Croton, for good reason, is well known and pampered by many. Right, Gary? Gary, number one, first row. He's from Dobbs Ferry. On its website, the Friends of the Old Croton Aqueduct describes itself as a private, nonprofit volunteer organization aimed at promoting its trailways, bicycle paths, 6 remaining gatehouses, and a keeper's house in Dobbs Ferry. It successfully organizes walks, hikes, tours, and talks, in some locations with lovely views of the Hudson. In 1992, on the 150th anniversary of the New York City water supply system, the DEP, which manages and protects the city's water supply, that now provides over 1 billion gallons of water each day to over 10 million residents, honored this aqueduct with a 17-page illustrated souvenir booklet. Meanwhile, still hidden deep in the ground, 130 years after its first waters trickled through tunnels 13.5 feet in diameter at the rate of 0.7 of an inch per mile on its 33 passageway to Manhattan, the enduring and dependable New Croton Aqueduct, unobserved and with little recognition, continues ready and available to serve potable water to the population of New York City and parts of Westchester whenever called upon. And while it may lack scenic walking trails or bicycle paths, tours, and other supports, nevertheless, the New Croton Aqueduct will always remain an indispensable part of the history of Ardsley. Thank you for listening.
I have some slides to show, but why don't we allow questions at this point? Mary?
Yeah, I just want to kind of figure out a little.
Thank you, Mary.
Boxing matches that you have in there. My husband was commander of the American Legion. He and Bud Whitman's
Yes.
were the ones who ran that.
Ah,
That's my contribution.
thank you. Because because I had this vague recollection, again, I wasn't there, of seeing a sign. So for
I
how,
ran it for the youth, I think the whole area, all around here.
so for what period of time did
Oh,
that go
don't
on?
ask me that.
So were they actually held on top of that
On
cement?
top of that, they roped it all off and.
On top of the slab?
Where they held it. And well, the Legion's Memorial Days were always held on top of that.
Yes,
Way back.
yes.
Because the parade used to go through the village and come up this way to the building. And all the dignitaries would sit on that,
On that slab. Call it a slab. Call it what it is.
Yeah.
Or we can say the site where the gatehouse to shaft 14 stood.
Walter, you didn't tell us who was familiar with the inside of the aqueduct.
Well, he's going to tell you. He's right in back of you.
I figured Jamie was down
I have a question first.
Uh-oh.
Since you have an easement for this property, who pays the taxes?
Well, New York City,
I believe they do on the tax.
well, villages, of course, are exempt from, villages don't pay taxes to the state.
Well, the municipality, from the way I understand, the municipality has to agree that another municipality or government doesn't have to pay it. But I know on the Catskill, they do pay, and I don't know if it's the whole thing, but at least portion of it, they do pay taxes on a portion of the Catskill aqueduct.
Yeah. Sometimes they get around, they don't call it taxes, they call it fee in lieu of, or something like that. But before I call upon you, Gary, second row. Yes, tell it, you were telling me a story when we were coming here.
I mentioned this to Walter as we were walking in, but I had mentioned it to some family members. I was probably one of the last individuals to be lowered into, I believe it's shaft 10 at the Tarrytown Lakes. You go up to the Tarrytown Lakes, the middle of the lakes, you'll see on the northern side there's 3 pumping stations. In the fall of 1976, I was working for an engineering company. We were doing work in Tarrytown. And we were doing some upgrades to the pump station, which was only the center one, went to Tarrytown. And we were doing work right behind it, on the next road behind it. I don't remember the name, it goes right up adjacent to Rockefeller's property. There is a shaft, and I think it's shaft 10. And they had to put all the pumps, piping, the shaft down to the aqueduct, and the new bowls on the bottom to draw the water up and pump it. And I didn't remember if it went into the distribution system or into their pump station in front of it. The contract, I was the inspector on the job, and the contractor went down there, put some planking down there, and pulled the old equipment out. Now it was my turn to go down and inspect what he did. So what they did, and you would never get away with this today, is they put some straps around me, put me in a 55-gallon drum
Oh my
on the
gosh.
back of a hoist. They had a cable that lowered me down. No air pack, no checking the air. The contractors had already been down there, but I had to get down and inspect. Now, I remember a number 55, I don't know if it was 55 feet or 155 feet. I was lowered down, and it didn't bother me. I went down, I looked at what was going on, and the water is rushing right by, and the thing that came to my mind, if I fall, I'm gone. I did my inspection, they hauled me back up, and at that point is where I got a little nervous because the barrel's going like this.
Confused is the word.
and it was brick coming up. And they had rungs, you know, where you would climb up or climb down. It wasn't a ladder that I remember, but there were rungs. And I remember the barrel going close to the rungs, and I take my hand and push away, you know. I got up to the top, but don't forget, I'm in my mid-20s. What did I care? Except that point coming up when the barrel's going back and forth. And I came up, got out of it. They put, after that, we put a new cap, similar to this, but much smaller, over it. They put their new equipment on. We finished the work. Then I did some other work when I was working for this engineering company in Tarrytown. We did some work, and that's why I say the workers were probably the last ones out of there because they had to bring all the wood and whatever else they had down there. I was probably one of the last ones in that shaft, and that was in the fall of 1976.
Ooh.
And when that was being done, they were just beginning to build the pump station to the right of it, which was for North Tarrytown. And then there's another one now to the left, and I don't know if it's for Briar Cliff or whoever. But at that point, in 1976, they were getting water from that new Croton Aqueduct, but they were also taking it from the Tarrytown Lakes, because if you go to the eastern side, there's an old building, and I was in that building many times. They had a filtration plant in there. And they would filter the water and send it into Tarrytown. They also took it out of the aqueduct. And I don't know if it was mixed when they sent it out. I don't remember any of the details, but those details. But it was fascinating. But it never dawned on me until later on in life. I said, you know, that cap is still there. That was probably one of the last ones to come out of that ship.
Thank you.
But it was very interesting to see.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
So Walter, two comments, 2 or 3 questions. Comment one is, when they built the new Croton Aqueduct, right out here was an old Native American settlement. And all along the building of the new Croton Aqueduct, they essentially ignored and obliterated many of these Native American settlements. We had more in Ardsley, really, than in Dobbs Ferry. But we have one right here, according to Blackie's map. So that was an unfortunate aspect of the building of the new Croton Aqueduct.
Gary, when you say there was a Native American settlement, do you mean there had once been?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, there was
Mhm.
the artifacts. and
Didn't know
things
that.
like The second thing is Worthington Station, which doesn't exist anymore on the old hut, was known as Aqueduct originally. So when they built the aqueduct in that area, they called that station Aqueduct, also similar to the street here. So the 2 other questions are...
That may be, beg your pardon, that may be where they crossed over.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
a crossover there with basically Sawmill River Road and the old hut, that where they sort of converged, where Worthington Station was.
Mhm.
That was called Aqueduct. There were a lot of similar
Mhm.
temporary structures and men living around that area. The 2 questions.
By the way, I beg your pardon again. I'm sorry. Pete and I were having conversation as to how old the American Legion building was, what year it was, and because of Aqueduct Street and the American Legion building, therefore they changed it to American Legion Drive, that kind of thing. And what was it, 52, Pete? It was 1952. The American Legion building came along, so I would suspect that Aqueduct Street came along around that time. That is to say, Aqueduct Street was changed to American Legion Drive around that time, the 50s, probably, and not sooner. Wouldn't have been before that. Wouldn't have made any sense to call it American Legion Drive before the American Legion building came. Okay.
So the 2 questions are, who were the workers? You discovered who were these workers?
I'll tell you a little bit about the ethnic makeup of what I found here. 2 sources for the aqueduct. This is according to Brewster Standard edition of 1886. Okay, contemporaneous. Most of the laborers were Italian, as reported in an article in the Brewster Standard, 1886. However, contractors were importing more and more black laborers from Virginia to do the heavy and dangerous work of excavating and constructing the tunnels. And then I added this note. By contrast, the Croton Dam was built upon the backs of 4,000, and this is a quote, Irish immigrants who had worked in Ireland for 10 cents a day from sunup to sundown when the potato famine hit Ireland in 1830. Their wages improved to 75 cents for a 10-hour day building the new dam, but even those low wages caused, quote, resistance and resentment from local Anglo-Saxon farmers who felt their jobs were threatened. This is an old story, and unfortunately it continues, and led to riots, strikes, unrest, and safety concerns, according to this very well-researched book called The History of the New Croton Dam. So that's the best answer I can give you on that. On the Worthington, I don't have any information. Thank you for providing that. I was told the dirt from some of the World's Fair went to Ardsley. So you've heard that too. So right now near us in White Plains, they're tearing down what was the Motor Vehicle Bureau in that whole area. And we're fascinated because we have a bird's eye view from our deck looking down on it. It's the next block. And Harry and I are wondering where these huge trucks are taking this stuff. And we were going to follow it one day. But we didn't. We didn't want to, thought we might get in trouble. Yes.
One fact, when they did the repair here in the late 90s, everybody going into the tunnel wore Scott packs and self-contained breathing apparatus.
Thank you.
because
Thank you.
It's toxic down there.
Thank you.
Which makes you a little concerned with this water, and it becomes toxic in a tunnel. That's what happens.
One night I was coming back from a meeting at the Ardsley Historical Society here in the library, 10 years ago, let's say. And I was walking in my car in the parking lot, and I see this car parked, it was dark, DEP, New York City. Saying, what the heck is the DEP doing up here in Ardsley at 9 o'clock at night, in the dark? Because they have the responsibility. They have like 5,000 employees, and they have a major responsibility. If anything adverse, that's not even the word, got into that water system, imagine? So they protected. Anybody else have a question who hasn't asked anything just yet, or a comment? Back to you.
When Scarsdale built their pump station in 1922 on Ardsley Road, they put Worthington pumps in that station. And I don't know if it was because of this or it was just a well-known pump, but Worthington pumps were the pumps that were originally installed in that station.
Okay.
Peter's going to give us a slide.
Yes.
Okay, so unfortunately, this is a little small, but follow the arrow, you can see this is Ashford Avenue, okay? And this, which is currently Legion Drive, is Aqueduct Street. And then over here, you would have the community nursery school, ASVAC, the library, and so on. And see where it says City of New York? This whole area is the Aqueduct and the blow-off property. Now, since, if you remember, we said that the Aqueduct in Ardsley is so close to the surface, so instead of boring through the ground, they had an open cut section. And this is what it looked like from up top. And then they built the sidewalls. And as Walter said, the bottom is pretty much flat, and then the other three sides, the top of the two sides, is that horseshoe appearance. And this would be where they would, sections where they would be drilling.
Pete, just 1 second. When I talked about the contractor fraud, so that would be right above the arc, you see, the top of the 13 feet, where that wasn't filled in the way it was supposed to be filled in. And then there's dirt on top and masonry above it, but that's where they cheated, and it cost lots of money and delay.
Again, typical horseshoe section and open cut. And this is the section for the Ardsley Gatehouse. Again, that's the 23 square foot cement slab that's out there by the parking lot. Workers taking a break because it is arduous work. Again, pictured inside the shaft. See, they're laying the bricks. Now, sometimes they're reinforced with iron, and this is a 12-foot diameter section waiting to be lowered into the aqueduct, and this is near 149th Street and Convent Avenue, circa 1888. And you can see by the men standing inside and sitting on top, that's a rather large section.
Unless they're very short people.
So here's another shaft. This is shaft 19, and you see the number of people. So this would be like 2 shifts of work. Some people just finishing and other people getting ready to go down. And this is below the Harlem River. They're getting ready to do blasting. They're basically drilling holes, putting in dynamite, and then everybody gets the heck out of there and they ignite the dynamite. Okay, feel free to come on up and take a look. And again, those of you that
Thank you. As always,
Thank you.
great job. Thank you.